Many are the plans in the mind of a man, but it is the purpose of the Lord that will stand. You know, sometimes we just aren't sure what to do or what way we should go. We have our own thoughts. We hear what's going on in the world and we say, I should do something about this. We see people do things that we disagree with, and we get angry and we find ourselves wanting to tear them down. We do this before we really know what God necessarily thinks about all of it. You know, we probably have a whole lot of different thoughts and understandings about what's happened in the last week. Because what's happened in the last week has been absolutely terrible. There are people who will dismiss the murder of George Floyd because of what's happening in our cities in Minneapolis and in Washington, D.C., and in Denver and Los Angeles. And yet, we can still think that what's going on is terrible while condemning what has happened. How are we as Christians called to condemn? How are we as Christians called to say what has happened is not right? It is not the way of the Lord. As I said earlier, we all have our very own ideas about what the best answer is and what the best response is. Before we respond, though, I want to invite you to think about what God's response is. What is God's response when we go wrong? What is God's response when we have messed up? For God still calls us to account for what we've done. God still calls for justice. Hopefully we can find the right answer at some point in time. The right answer, though, often comes with twists and turns. Twists and turns that we certainly aren't necessarily comfortable with. Twists and turns that'll challenge what we have thought before and what we think about others. What we think about those even closest to us. What we think about God. And yet God calls us to discern. God calls us not to move into our own understanding right away, but rather to seek what God's truth is, what God's knowledge is, what God's direction is for us in these times. You've probably noticed I'm on a labyrinth now. Labyrinths are interesting because they take us to and fro. They pull us in different directions, reminding us of the way that God shapes us, the way that God stretches us, and the way that God often calls us on journeys that don't exactly seem like straight paths. The cool thing about labyrinths, though, is they're not really mazes. We know that we're going to get to our destination. We know that we're going to get out of that destination. We know that God will take us where we need to go. This is what I believe about prayer in this time, especially as we seek to discern the will that God has for us in our lives, how God wants us to respond to the hate of others. how God wants us to try to understand people when anger overtakes them. Hopefully we too can learn how to understand, how to love, how to forgive, and how to accept all, no matter who they are or what they've done. This is what God's done for us. That's good news.